Welcome back, everyone. Today we are continuing with Book 2 of The Gay Science, and these are the sections that devote the most attention, I would say, to art. The considerations here concern, among other things, the understanding of different artistic moods or states of mind as they were experienced by those living in different times, different cultures, and also the prospect of translating one such experience into the understanding of another culture. To what degree can this be done? And to what degree is there a fundamental difference in, for example, the tempo of thought, or a difference in taste, or a difference in the use of the artistic medium? And there's also some exploration of the artistic drive and their relationship of truth and appearance in the arts, which is sort of a continual focus for Nietzsche. But we'll begin with section 76, which doesn't concern art quite yet, but it's a very important passage. It concerns a related topic, which is now a very familiar topic to the podcast in recent months, which is madness and the mediation between madness and reason. So this is section 76. Quote, "The greatest danger. If the majority of men had not always considered the discipline of their minds, their rationality, a matter of pride, an obligation, and a virtue, feeling insulted or embarrassed by all fantasies and debaucheries of thought, because they saw themselves as friends of healthy common sense, humanity would have perished long ago. The greatest danger that always hovered over humanity, and still hovers over it, is the eruption of madness, which means the eruption of arbitrariness in feeling, seeing, and hearing, the enjoyment of the mind's lack of discipline, the joy in human unreason." End quote. This passage is so interesting to consider. Before we continue with the rest of the passage, I just want to make some remarks here. It's very interesting to consider this passage in light of many of the other sources that we've looked at during the first part of Season 5, particularly Jung, Foucault, Tartre, even to some extent Mishima. There's this idea that we've been exploring, which can be summed up by the phrase that Nietzsche uses here, the joy in human unreason. Remember that Foucault speaks of the sovereign unreason that governs madness, that psychoanalysis, in Foucault's view, cannot understand or even really approach. And Foucault sort of opposes the natural freedom of the madman to the discipline and brutalizing of so-called enlightened society, under which opposition to madness and incarceration of the madman begins. So that's in Foucault's work. Or we have, in Donna Tartt's work, the character Julian Morrow in his lecture, speaking about the intense need for some sort of break from rationality and order and self-control. The appeal of the Dionysian is presented in that lecture as the appeal of madness. And Julian seduces his students to seek after that Dionysian madness. But we should ask ourselves, how could he do this unless madness had some sort of inherent appeal to it? Which is a very strange thought from the ordinary, we might say, conventional perspective on madness. And Carl Jung, he treats this ever-present appeal of madness as a reality, a dangerous reality to human civilization that lurks right beneath the surface. It's a substratum of society that is given to latent insanity. And again, Jung presents the rule of reason, which is to say, modern, liberal, orderly society based on constitutional government, respect for rights and the dignity of man and so on. Jung sees that as something precarious precisely because we're all easily seduced by this appeal of madness. Jung presents this kind of chaotic frenzy as something which we might consciously deny, and yet history would seem to show that man relapses into this state with some regularity. And I would include Mishima just insofar as he's looking for this kind of, I would say he is seduced or attracted to that kind of madness. He's looking for that kind of ecstasy in self-forgetting, this going beyond the rational or the conceptual, going beyond that which can be explained in words. Mishima's quest is to find that Dionysian frenzy beneath the surface of modern analytical life. So, what is Nietzsche's explanation for our ability to resist the appeal of unreason? That's sort of the thread I'm trying to tease out here, is that there is an appeal to unreason that is often denied or ignored, but Nietzsche clues right into it here. And I think what Nietzsche points out, because that creates then, therefore, a problem for his position, or if not a problem, at least a riddle or a question of how sanity could be explained, right? And so Nietzsche explains this by saying that there is a kind of joy that we take in the feeling of the discipline of our intellect. Or to put it into slightly different language, the feeling of power in one's own rationality. There is a feeling of pride that you can take in being unmoved by fantasies or debaucheries of thought, as Nietzsche puts it. And so, without this feeling of the power in the intellect, this feeling of one wielding power with their intellect, the appeal of madness would have won out long, long ago. This is important because it's explanatory of Nietzsche's whole mature philosophy, in some sense. So, Nietzsche is critical of the notion that reason is actually sovereign, or that the dialectic is effective, or, the Enlightenment, the spreading of rationality to the populace. Nietzsche's skeptical that this will have a quote-unquote good effect on society. But on the other hand, it's clear that we don't live like self-forgetting Dionysian revelers. It's clear that the ordered, rational society, to be frank, has a lot of power behind it. So how could the rule of reason have achieved that power if reason is so impotent? And what Nietzsche's arguing here is that it's not as if man has a natural inclination to be reasonable or to yield to reasonable arguments. It's rather that he takes a natural pride in discipline because of the feeling of power that accompanies it. And reason is therefore a tool of self-discipline. It's a way of exercising power over oneself and one's decisions. It's a code of behavior. It tells you to be unmoved in the face of emotional arguments or flights of fancy. That's the power of the rule of reason. That it is, in so many words, a morality. It has moral power, meaning power to shape human action and behavior. And it's associated with feelings of power, feelings of pleasure, and further, it acts as a means of expressing that power. And this has proven stronger than the allure of a purely Dionysian self-forgetting. So with that, let's continue with the passage. Quote, "Not truth and certainty are the opposite of the world of the madman, but the universality and the universal binding force of a faith. In sum, the non-arbitrary character of judgments, and man's greatest labor so far has been to reach agreement about very many things and to submit to a law of agreement, regardless of whether these things are true or false. This is the discipline of the mind that mankind has received. But the contrary impulses are still so powerful that at bottom we cannot speak of the future of mankind with much confidence. The image of things still shifts and shuffles continually, and perhaps even more so and faster from now on than ever before. Continually, precisely the most select spirits bristle at this universal binding force, the explorers of truth above all. Continually, this faith, as everybody's faith, arouses nausea and a new lust for subtler minds, and the slow tempo that is here demanded for all spiritual processes, this imitation of the tortoise, which is here recognized as the norm, would be quite enough to turn artists and thinkers into apostates. It is in these impatient spirits that a veritable delight in madness erupts, because madness has such a cheerful tempo. Thus the virtuous intellects are needed. Oh, let me use the most unambiguous word. What is needed is virtuous stupidity. Stolid metronomes for the slow spirit to make sure that the faithful of the great shared faith stay together and continue their dance. It is a first-rate need that commands and demands this. We others are the exception and the danger, and we need eternally to be defended. Well, there actually are things to be said in favor of the exception, provided that it never wants to become the rule." End quote. So, to review, the difference between the sane man and the madman is not that the sane man possesses truth and certainty and the madman doesn't. The difference is that the propositions that the sane man accepts as truth and as certainties are accepted universally by all those around him. The sane man has submitted to a law of agreement, as Nietzsche puts it. So the madman has just as much certainty in his beliefs. It's just that his beliefs are not shared by the community at large. The community at large has not submitted to those beliefs. They have not agreed to them. They've agreed to a different set of shared beliefs. And Nietzsche says this is regardless of whether they're true or false. Now, I could see some people who believe in, correspondence theories of the truth and so on taking issue with this. And if you do take issue with this, set aside for a second how reliable you think majority opinion is, and just consider how it is that the majority of people come to their opinions, whether those opinions are true or not. How do they get there? And we find that psychologically, for example, people's political affiliation can completely change their positions regarding, for example, scientific facts, right? So that's something that is an opinion about the way you think society should be run, but that's going to alter your perception of the truth of the objective world. And we find political affiliation, well, what does that belief spring from? Well, that correlates with things like geographic location and family beliefs. What you think about how the world works, politically, ethically, metaphysically, will probably have a lot to do with how your immediate peer group thinks about the world, and how you were raised and what country you're from. And so, in short, we find beliefs are not, by and large, arrived at by a strictly rational process. Most of us come to our beliefs through social agreement and through biased thinking, or just according to prejudicial metrics or guidelines for our thought. It's a well-known effect now that the experts in any given field are known for overestimating their knowledge when it comes to other fields. Even they are subject to their own prejudices when they're making judgments on topics outside of their expertise. And so none of this means your beliefs aren't true. It means that no one is an expert in everything, and understanding the real reason why a given proposition is true, whether that means understanding the actual math behind a mathematical or statistical claim, understanding the actual historical evidence behind a factual claim about history, understanding the actual legal reasoning behind why a legal precedent was set, whatever the case may be. That is simply not how most of us come to our beliefs in these things. We end up having to trust other human beings, trust their veracity, and work out some sort of broad social agreement as to what constitutes the truth. And part of the general malaise today is that we're increasingly unable to do this. Although, that's neither here nor there as regards Nietzsche's point in this passage. So Nietzsche is saying that the discipline of the mind has been achieved by the social pressure of the collective. But because the joy and madness, the appeal of unreason is so powerful, owing to the fact that this is really the deep ecstasy of life, the joy and play of the impulses and instincts, without being sort of shackled by reason, because they're far older than reason. It's really the stuff of life, at least certainly from Nietzsche's perspective. Because that joy and unreason is so powerful, in spite of the thousands of years of domestication of the human animal, we can't speak of the future with certainty. And so, Nietzsche brings that up as a kind of an offhanded remark here, but that is the fear that haunted Carl Jung in his essay, The Undiscovered Self. And here in the second half of the passage, Nietzsche addresses himself to the free spirits, the subtler minds who have a new lust, a new temptation, as it were, to go beyond the universal truth, which is established by the social agreement. And once again, as he does in Human All Too Human, Nietzsche describes this quest to discover the truth that's over and above all social agreements about it. Nietzsche describes that quest as something one proceeds toward at a tortoise pace. So it's not free-spirited in the sense of whirling about the cosmos on a whim, the cosmos of your own thought, but it's a steady, gradual movement. And it's interesting at the end of the passage because he brings madness into it again. So for a slow spirit who's proceeding at a tortoise pace, madness becomes even more appealing because of its fast tempo. So just the associations that we should think about in this passage. Madness is associated with energy, movement, chaos. Again, in a word, frenzy. That's what oftentimes when Nietzsche's talking about madness, he's talking about this sort of Dionysian frenzied madness, not so much as mental illness, right? I guess mental illness could be included, but really, I guess when we're talking about madness here, Nietzsche's discussing liberation from social norms, liberation from self-knowledge, from the burden or the obligation to hold self-knowledge, and therefore from liberation from the shackles of the ego consciousness, and consequently dissolving into a kind of joy of a primordial state of being. And this sentiment of Nietzsche's, it reminds me of something, actually. I went and grabbed this quote from G.K. Chesterton, who wrote, quote, "Imagination does not breed insanity. Exactly what does breed insanity is reason." Poets do not go mad, but chess players do. Mathematicians go mad, and cashiers, but creative artists very seldom. I am not, as will be seen, in any sense attacking logic. I only say that this danger does lie in logic, not in imagination." End quote. For a Catholic, that G.K. Chesterton was pretty insightful. So why would this be? That reason breeds madness. I mean, we philosophical types, or logicians, seekers after truth, we're quite similar to that seeker in Schiller's poem that we talked about last time, The Veiled Image at Sais. We're hungry to know. We're desirous to cognize the noumenon, as they say, to possess the knowledge that makes the world intelligible to us beyond the understanding of other ordinary people. And that hunger, that passion for knowledge drives us to, as in the poem, the character in the poem, it drives us to go too far, to try and just rip off that veil of reality and rush forward, not at a tortoise pace, but a hare's pace, so to speak. And accordingly, a delight in madness arises in such people. We might think of Pascal. He's a mathematician, a scientist, a statistical thinker. And he's also a man who has a severe psychotic episode or, a religious experience, depending on who you ask about it. And he's just burnt up with this desire to know. I mean, his great torment is the Deus absconditus, the hiddenness of the divine, the lack of knowledge about the will of God, that even the martyrs have to fear until the day of judgment. Also, Foucault's examination of Erasmus, the way in which he places among his host of fools, Erasmus does, the jurists, the grammarians, logicians, what does he say? Philosophers long in beard. And that, Foucault draws out that association in the Renaissance period between the man of reason and madness, that the seeker after truth is the one who goes mad, who becomes a fool, that because seeking after truth is a folly because of the inherent frailty of human reason. So of course you end up as the fool. Whereas the artistic type perhaps has more of an outlet for his madness. He's more insulated against that kind of excess. And it's precisely because it's a excessive compensation that the logical mind is so drawn to madness. And that's precisely why Nietzsche says, well, my free spirits need to have a virtuous stupidity. They have to remain at that slow tempo. So don't burn yourselves out. Save your energy. Hoard up your spirit. And, maybe you still end up squandering it all one day, but maybe it can be a more meaningful, a more intentional squandering, an effective squandering. The key point is that the free spirit is a slow spirit. So, and then the final lines. We are the exception and the danger, and we need eternally to be defended. That's, again, it's a very typical Nietzschean sentiment. The collective crushes down the exception. The rule, whatever it is hostile to exceptions. And yet the exception is the driver of all change, all progress, all increases in power and complexity. The mutation is what improves the genome. So we need exceptions. The exceptions need their advocates, and Nietzsche is such an advocate because the rule already has a million advocates. They don't need any more. Basically, every intellectual and philosopher is an advocate for the rule. Most of the time when it comes to moral philosophy, we reason backward from the current accepted moral standards to, why this is the truth of morality. But Nietzsche also says, quote, provided that the exception does not want to become the rule, end quote. And that's the great mistake that I think many make when approaching Nietzsche. He's not a universalist. He doesn't imagine that his worldview, his Weltanschauung, is a thing that ought to be adopted, certainly not imposed on the whole world. In fact, he would say that such a thing would be impossible. It would actually be counterproductive if you tried. And so the total picture of this aphorism is the picture of a society, of modern society, under the rule of reason that endures by imposing a discipline that demands submission to common agreed-upon beliefs and valuations. Because this discipline is pleasurable and powerful. That's why we all accept this rule. And yet, because the allure of madness is almost equally powerful, there's a kind of unsettled question regarding which one will reign supreme. There's a continual, perpetual tension. And so notice that once again we have Apollo and Dionysus here from a certain perspective. They aren't named by those terms, but some echo of that idea appears again in a conceptual form here. Self-knowledge versus self-dissolution. The the production of an ordered society based on what are essentially artistic illusions, metaphysics, and morals, and these are observed not because of their truth, but because of their necessity to us. And in eternal tension with this situation, the vital spirit of life, the animal origin of life, power of the instincts and ecstasy of self-forgetting, and so on. In a word, Dionysian madness. Nietzsche does not provide a reconciliation or a solution. He instead pivots to talk about the free spirit, albeit also not directly by name, but that's who he's describing, because by implication, that is the solution. The slow tempo that is here demanded for all spiritual processes, as he puts it. He doesn't say what the spiritual process is, because how could he, right? The quote-unquote solution to the eternal tension between Dionysus and Apollo is the continual arising of exceptional people who continue to sort of advance the spiritual life of the society by small degrees. As Nietzsche argued in his earlier essays, the exceptional artist, the creator, the legislator, that's the goal of the great tension that's produced in society. But that underlying tension is never settled, quote-unquote, and you wouldn't really want it to be. What's needful is a culture that thrives off that tension. And to do this, what a culture needs is that spiritual subtlety, spiritual development or guidance or whatever. In the same way that the priest in the olden times was a kind of alchemist of the emotions, shaping and guiding and directing the emotions of his flock, telling them how to feel, so to speak, soothing them in times of hardship, and maybe evoking zealotry in times of sloth or something like that. The philosopher of the future, it would be less like an alchemist and more like a chemist of the spirit, a more advanced tinkerer with the zeitgeist, we might say. But the point is, this is the big point for Nietzsche, society, systems of government, and so on, these don't advance, they don't actually progress. Or rather, if they do change and progress, that's an effect, it's not a cause. What changes is mankind. What we need to cultivate are people, extraordinary human beings, right? Because that's where the progress, quote-unquote, actually occurs. Subtler, wiser, more beautiful souls. And so the Dionysian versus Apollonian interplay that's been in Nietzsche's mind since Birth of Tragedy, it still remains in the present day. It's just we've had subpar spiritual guidance, we might say, under the Christian thought regime. And the chemistry of concepts and feelings that Nietzsche proposes in Human All Too Human is therefore what I think he has in mind here, in invoking the slow spirit, this explorer of truth who moves at a slow and steady pace. This is the joyful scientist, the new musical Socrates type, who will now have raised into his consciousness the truth that what is needful is the elevation of human beings, not the tinkering with social systems. Resolving the tension actually sort of kills the productivity of society, of culture. And the point of culture is to produce these spirits. So we spent a lot of time on that first passage, but I think it's a really important one, so it was worth lingering on. But now let's go to number 77. Quote, "The animal with a good conscience. The vulgar element in everything that gives pleasure in Southern Europe, whether it be Italian opera, for example, Rossini and Bellini, or the Spanish novel of adventure, most readily accessible for us in the French disguise of Gil Blas, does not escape me, but it does not offend me any more than does the vulgarity that one encounters as one walks through Pompeii and actually also as one reads any ancient book. How come? Is it because there is no sense of shame, and everything vulgar appears as poised and self-assured as anything noble, lovely, and passionate in the same sort of music or novel? The animal has as much right as any human being. Let it run about freely. And you, my dear fellow man, are also still an animal, in spite of everything. That seems to me to be the moral of this story and the peculiarity of Southern humanity. Bad taste has its rights no less than good taste, and even a prior right, if it corresponds to a great need, provides certain satisfaction and, as it were, a universal language, an absolutely intelligible mask and gesture. Compared to that, good, elegant taste always seems somewhat deliberate and contrived, and not altogether sure how it will be understood. It never is or has been popular. What is and remains popular is the mask. Hence, there is no point in objecting to the element of masquerade in the melodies and cadenzas, and the leaps and jollities that mark the rhythms of these operas. And as for ancient life, what can we understand of that as long as we do not understand the delight in masks, and the good conscience in using any kind of mask? Here is the bath and the recreation of the ancient spirit, and perhaps the rare and sublime characters of the ancient world needed this bath even more than the vulgar. A vulgar turn in northern works, on the other hand, in German music, for example, offends me unspeakably. Here, there is a sense of shame. The artist has lowered himself in his own eyes and could not even help blushing. We are ashamed with him and feel so offended because we sense that he considered it necessary to lower himself for our sake." End quote. So this northern versus southern Europe distinction appears here. It's something that Nietzsche discusses in other places. If you're familiar with Nietzsche's work and what he says about this elsewhere, you'll probably get this passage really quickly. So first, we'll set aside whatever concerns we might have about making broad cultural stereotypes. What Nietzsche's putting forth is something, nevertheless, that I think most people in Europe would probably agree with. There's a general difference in spirit, I guess, in temperament and the tempo of life between Northern and Southern Europe. Chalk it up to climate, if nothing else. I mean, the Germans are sort of associated with the Northern Europeans in Nietzsche's work, and Nietzsche, as he says, is the despiser of Germans par excellence, and so he unsurprisingly seems to side with the Southern European sensibilities, those of Italy and Spain and the south of France. And we might also think of the comments he makes about the Italian Renaissance in The Antichrist, for example, that he compares to the German Reformation. So we have the artistic movement of Michelangelo and Raphael, which is Catholic and fundamentally humanist. It's a celebration of humanity in some sense, with all of the contradictions that entails, right? When you pair that celebration of humanity with the otherworldism of Catholicism. So then contrast that to Luther. His movement is Protestant. It's fundamentally theological. It's not artistic. It's an attempt to purify the faith, to excise the contradictions, to condemn the human, all too human aspects of the Catholic Church, which would seem to lower it or vulgarize it into a merely worldly institution, something like that. And so here, Nietzsche uses the examples of Italian opera and Spanish adventures, but he says, this feeling of the South is also shared in the ancient world. And I mean, in Europe, the ancient world is Greece and Rome, which originates in the South. So the feeling one gets while walking through Pompeii or reading an ancient book is more similar to the world feeling of a modern Southern European than that of the Northerner. And we're going to get to this aphorism later in this very book of the Gay Science, but Nietzsche talks about how the Greeks held festivals to celebrate their all too human, as he puts it. The Greeks acknowledged the animal within man and gave it its place. They allowed themselves to say, as he sort of puts it paraphrastically in this passage, "You, my dear fellow man, are also still an animal in spite of everything." That is a mature acceptance of human nature. We might say boys will be boys attitude, or rather apes will be apes, right? That is characteristic of Southern Europe, the way Nietzsche puts it in this passage. That's how the Catholic Church during the Renaissance could have popes that fathered illegitimate children. They looked on with a shrug and said, well, the Pope may be the infallible representative of God on earth, but after all, they're only human. And so I think Nietzsche's remarks in the second half of this aphorism about the mask, I think, can be understood in that way. He says that there's this universal mask, the universal language, the intelligible mask and gesture that characterizes the Southern mentality, which he says has an element of the masquerade. In comparison to this, or in contrast with this, good and elegant taste seems deliberate and contrived. And so when Nietzsche's invoking the festival of the masquerade, we might think of the Masquerade of Venice, that rather enchanting festival when people wander the streets of the floating city in these very distinctive and somewhat carnival-like masks. But so that was like a celebration of the mask, right? And Nietzsche ties this kind of celebration of the mask, the masquerade, to the outlook of people of antiquity, who had a delight in masks and the good conscience in using any kind of mask. So remember the previous comment that Nietzsche's made, that the Greeks were a nation of actors, that being able to act a role convincingly was a virtue to them. We might also think of Nietzsche's lectures on rhetoric, where he says that the Greeks would rather be persuaded than convinced. And he says in a passage we'll get to later in this book, they love to hear people speak beautifully. This is an echo of Machiavelli's assessment of the pagan religions of Greece and Rome, which, as Machiavelli writes, were all pomp and show, and self-consciously so. And so that's the image that Nietzsche is giving of the ancient world, which we could summarize as a self-consciousness of the inherent falsehood involved in the social life. And in Japan, they have a helpful set of concepts of hone and tatamai, the face you show the world versus the inner life. There's the outward-facing reality, like the public reality that everyone acknowledges, versus the truth under the surface, which everyone might know about but does not publicly acknowledge. It's no less real, but it's kept in the background, right? It's kept behind the mask. And so the ancients here are described by Nietzsche as people who are entirely attuned to that outward-facing world, the world of appearances, with full knowledge that that's what they're doing. And so when they celebrate in the form of the masquerade or pay tribute to the gods at the theater, they are by that token acknowledging the mask itself. And Nietzsche says that was the bath and the recreation of the ancient spirit. So what would that mean? That means they periodically cleansed themselves, recreated themselves in a festive acknowledgement of the fact that all appearances are just that. They are, in fact, appearances. Nietzsche ends the passage by pivoting back to talking about the northern works. So in contrast to southern operas, whenever there's a vulgar turn in a German opera, for some reason, Nietzsche says it offends me. And this passage makes me wonder what Nietzsche would have felt about, the abduction from the Seraglio, Mozart's opera set in the Turkish harem that, is the subject of that famous scene from Amadeus. You might know it from that scene. The artists of the northern culture feel a sense of shame when exposing the animal and man. Even when they attempt to do so perhaps subversively, the shame is there nonetheless because we know the artist is lowering himself for our sake. Whereas perhaps for the southern artist, he does not even consider it to be a lowering to show the animal and man. That, everyone within his cultural zeitgeist already tacitly acknowledges. They already believe that the outward-facing social mask is just a mask, and that at the end of the day, you, my dear fellow man, are still an animal in spite of everything. So whereas the Lutherans would say, no, man doesn't have to be merely an animal. We can become more than that. Look at the lives of the saints. By the time we get to Calvin, we get this fixation on the concept of the elect, the idea that there are those who are qualitatively different from the rest of humanity, the rest of us sinners, because they've been chosen. So the northern desire for purity pushes them to deny the mask, to suggest that the civilized moral man is like the real state of being, and that the so-called animal nature of man is merely, in the classical Christian theology, that's just a curse on his flesh, that salvation thankfully allows us to truly leave behind. Whereas the southern attitude seems to, perhaps insensibly, still deal with and reconcile with the animal and man. And, Nietzsche is not simple-minded. He very rarely comes down on one side of things, but in this passage he's very clearly on the side of the southern European sensibilities. So with that, let's move on to number 78. Quote, "What should win our gratitude? Only artists, and especially those of the theater, have given men eyes and ears to see and hear with some pleasure what each man is himself, experiences himself, desires himself. Only they have taught us to esteem the hero that is concealed in everyday characters. Only they have taught us the art of viewing ourselves as heroes, from a distance and, as it were, simplified and transfigured. The art of staging and watching ourselves. Only in this way can we deal with some base details in ourselves. Without this art, we would be nothing but foreground and live entirely in the spell of that perspective which makes what is closest at hand and most vulgar appear as if it were vast and reality itself. Perhaps one should concede a similar merit to the religion that made men see the sinfulness of every single individual through a magnifying glass, turning the sinner into a great immortal criminal. By surrounding him with eternal perspectives, it taught man to see himself from a distance and as something past and whole." End quote. So a beautiful Nietzschean turn occurs in this passage, and Nietzsche often does this. It's part of his method, or his perspectival method. And this is also why Kaufmann, among others, describes Nietzsche as non-systematic or even anti-systematic, although I think that goes perhaps a bit too far. The previous section sort of depends on this whole construction of the ancient world. Again, thinking here of the Greeks and Romans as people who celebrated the mask, everything we just talked about, right? The mere appearance. What was the main way that the Greeks did this? In the theater. That's where they created artistic representations of great heroes and of gods who then dramatized these mythological stories by rendering them in scenes and dialogues between masked characters. And think of what they dramatize. In the Oresteia, lust, revenge, matricide, guilt, the witch's brew of cruelty and sexuality, the cycle of reciprocal violence in which vengeance begets vengeance, the destruction of heroic characters out of fated necessity. In effect, the entire, panoply of human life, the entire human drama, the suffering of the human condition, mortality, fate, and so on. And yet the hero on the stage is a mere representation. He's a masked actor. He's not really being killed before our eyes. Most of the murder happens off stage anyway. Mostly it's just characters giving beautiful or moving speeches. But no one could mistake the masked actor for the real thing, right? And so we might conclude that the Greek acknowledgement that they dwelt in a world of appearance would sort of translate to a light-heartedness, a desire not to take life too seriously or something like that. But now, so Nietzsche flips that whole formula on its head, because if we remember from Birth of Tragedy, he argues that the real power of the Greek theater is precisely that the audience was able to see the masked actor as the real thing. And he asks whether mass hallucinations, a mass departure from the ordinary perceptions of reality, are possible through drama. And he suggests that this is what happened for the Greeks at the Dionysia. And accordingly, in this passage, he suggests, in fact, portrayal of human beings in this representational form, in dramatic form, really in any artistic form, is actually what we have to thank for our ability to inquire about our inner life and our inner workings, what psychoanalysts would later call the unconscious. Without this art, without the theater, without these portrayals of human life, the portrayals of our motives and actions, and the way that the characters justify themselves, and the way their words relate to their deeds, and so on, we would be nothing but foreground. So it's portraying human life in this representational form that actually gets us beyond the mere appearance. And so, to put this maybe more straightforwardly, we might think of Nietzsche's remarks on psychology that are found in Twilight of the Idols. We talked about many of those passages at the end of last season. Who does he single out as the great psychologists? Well, when Nietzsche's writing Twilight of Idols, there's no serious field of scientific research at that time called psychology. Instead, all of Nietzsche's great psychologists are novelists. Stendhal, Dostoevsky. And what does the novel do? It allows us to zero in on a human being's inner life, their flaws, their pathologies, their sinfulness, if you will, but also, perhaps their positive side. And we see it all under a magnifying glass. And that is much of the language that Nietzsche uses throughout this passage, the language of changing sizes. And that's really the way that art works, according to Nietzsche. That's the way it deceives us. It magnifies or it enlarges. It brings certain aspects into the foreground. And then it also, by that same token, minimizes or reduces by putting other elements in the background, kind of blurring them out. And so the Greek drama, for instance, magnifies certain characteristics. That gives us an idealized image. And it's like seeing a simplified, magnified version from a distance, where all you can see are one or two strong personality traits, right? So from a distance, you don't see every detail of what a person looks like. You just sort of see the general shape, size, maybe a few defining features that they have. So we're lowering the resolution. We're seeing less clearly. We're only seeing a few things. That's how characters in a novel typically have to be written. They can have one or two, maybe three strong traits. And that's akin to seeing a couple strong features of a person from a distance, right? The most defining features. And so by engaging in that sort of artistic oversimplification, we can take, an aspect We can explore one aspect, understand that aspect insofar as it's shared by many human beings. We can explore it through one character where that's their defining trait. So Hamlet is a character who's indecisive and who's self-doubting, who has a desire to act but can't find the will, can't find the blueprint for action. This is basically just one magnified character trait, but it's a trait that many of us share. In real life, most people are more complicated than one or two traits, but by magnifying them in Hamlet, everyone who experiences that feeling, or who finds something of that trait in themselves, gains some kind of psychological understanding. And so by the route of simplifying or falsifying the world, to put it bluntly, presenting a magnified, simplified version of certain traits, we arrive, paradoxically, at profundity. Perhaps in the same way that Dr. Frankenstein had to build a human being of monstrous size, because he had to work with larger constituent parts, because, the parts of the human physiology would ordinarily be too small for a human being to work with. So in order to understand the inner workings of the human being, we had to magnify and simplify our inner life to such a degree that we could comprehend it out here in the world of appearances, so that those traits could appear on stage embodied. And that's how we've done this. We've achieved that through art. And so art, through illusion and superficiality, has made human life less superficial and more profound. So in some ways, it's actually the inverse of the way that Nietzsche talks about theater in the previous passage. And both insights, I think, are true, even though they seem contradictory. And of course, the final comment in the passage is actually about religion and its ability to sort of get into our inner psychology about all of our sins, right? Magnifying even the smallest sinful trait as being of the greatest importance and sort of focusing our attention on that. We might say that a Greek epic poem might magnify a few heroic traits, and then the Christian inner life takes our sinfulness and magnifies it to a monstrous degree. Notably, in this passage, Nietzsche would say we should be grateful for both of these kinds of operations, even though Nietzsche himself would have a completely different valuation about sort of the, the health or sickness of these two relative processes, right? He would see Greek drama as something supremely healthy, and the Christian inner morality, this dance of guilt and pride and all this sort of cruelty directed inward, as a very sick inner process. And yet both of them have this downstream consequence of magnifying our inner life, which allows us to comprehend it, which allows us to actually have a more profound understanding of human beings through this oversimplification. So let's go to 79. Quote, "The attraction of imperfection. Here I see a poet who, like many a human being, is more attractive by virtue of his imperfections than he is by all the things that grow to completion and perfection under his hands. Indeed, he owes his advantages and fame much more to his ultimate incapacity than to his ample strength. His works never wholly express what he would like to express and what he would like to have seen. It seems as if he had had the foretaste of a vision and never the vision itself. But a tremendous lust for this vision remains in his soul, and it is from this that he derives his equally tremendous eloquence of desire and craving. By virtue of this lust, he lifts his listeners above his work and all mere works, and lends them wings to soar as high as listeners had never soared. Then, having themselves been transformed into poets and seers, they lavish admiration upon the creator of their happiness, as if he had led them immediately to the vision of what was for him the holiest and ultimate, as if he had attained his goal and had really seen and communicated his vision. His fame benefits from the fact that he never reached his goal." End quote. I think this passage is very, again, certain life experiences or a certain background can make this passage very easy to grasp, especially if you're a poet or a musician or a writer. There's something about it you can only really grasp if you're in one of those categories. But there's sort of, that continual quest to leap beyond the mundane and the prosaic and convey a profound vision, and furthermore, one that's actually received and understood and strikes deep into the souls of other people. I think poetry is perhaps a special case because it's peculiar in that one attempts to use words to say something beyond the mere information which is conveyed by what the words signify. Mishima talks about this, the fact that writers attempt to say what can't be said by language, and somehow they succeed sometimes. That from the beginning of the use of the written word as a form of art, we've always had an attraction to those who subvert the written word, because that's what occurs when we use language in a novel way, when we find a new sense that's created by certain combinations of adjectives, or when we counterpose two apparently unrelated metaphors or images, and we find in combination they reveal some new feeling that neither fully expressed on its own. That's what attracts us. That's what leads us to say, this writer has made an innovation. He has elevated the language. It's the fact that he subverted it, the fact that he used the words in the way that they were not intended, or created some third meaning by an admixture that perhaps is contradictory or strange or shouldn't exist within language. And so many poets live in pursuit of that goal, to convey their inner feeling, which is something that would seem to be untranslatable, and that would require one to subvert in some way in order to convey it. And it's not easy to achieve either to achieve the goal or to know that the goal has been achieved. And so many artists, and especially poets, live in a kind of perpetual frustration of feeling like they haven't fully expressed the sense or the feeling that they wish to convey, and searching over and over again, ever searching for that magical combination of words that somehow conveys this feeling that there's no ordinary word for. And ultimately, they'll probably never be satisfied, because it's impossible to know on an intellectual level, to an absolute certainty, that someone else truly understands the way that you feel. But what Nietzsche says here is useful, insofar as it could be applied to so many human ambitions, even beyond the arts. There are those who succeed precisely because they've never hit the mark. And, I've lived in that kind of Sisyphean struggle myself. You're always trying to top the previous album, and no matter what, you always can kind of find the little flaws, the little imperfections, the little ways that you didn't quite achieve that platonic ideal that's in your head. But, if I felt that I had made the perfect album on my first try, I never would have made 11 more albums, or how many more I've made over the years. It's quite a ridiculous number. But, a final note here, actually, something else that comes to mind. The Oscar curse, the idea that actors who win the highest award in acting for their first major role, they have a habit of, quickly fading into obscurity. Now, in reality, things are more complicated than this, I suppose I should say. For example, F. Murray Abraham, he was said to be a victim of this curse, but he always sort of insisted. He said, I've had an amazing career. I don't regard this as a curse at all. But nevertheless, there are many examples of creative types peaking early and then disappearing. And why would this be? Well, perhaps one reason is that you lose the drive to bring other people along. You feel like you've already achieved that, and you're sort of, you no longer have that fire within you. And so, we return to the perennial wisdom of Mr. Spock, that having is not as pleasurable as wanting, that pursuit of goals, being in the state of being in pursuit of your goals, that is when human beings are at our best. And when people finish their PhD, usually they don't report a feeling of happiness. Usually they report becoming depressed. It's become a cliche at this point, but, as Nietzsche says, he who has a why can bear any how. That it's the striving is the healthy state for us. And there are perhaps many artists who have only been invigorated or have only been enlivened to continue to pursue their art by the knowledge that they have never yet measured up to the level of greatness that they desire, or that they know they have the potential to create. That I have not yet produced my magnum opus. That's what keeps them going. And perhaps that's how somebody like Goethe can work on Faust as his magnum opus for his entire life and not feel frustrated with that, because, in some sense that's like giving him his purpose, giving him his continued lease on an artistic life, the knowledge that his magnum opus is still yet to come. So with that, let's return to ancient Greece once more. We're going to move on to section 80. Quote, "Art and nature, The Greeks, or at least the Athenians, liked to hear people speak well. Nothing distinguishes them so thoroughly from non-Greeks as does this truly greedy craving. Even of passion on the stage, they demanded that it should speak well, and they endured the unnaturalness of dramatic verse with rapture. In nature, passion is so poor in words, so embarrassed and all but mute, or when it finds words, so confused and irrational and ashamed of itself. Thanks to the Greeks, all of us have now become accustomed to this unnatural stage convention, just as we tolerate, and tolerate gladly, thanks to the Italians, that other unnatural convention, passion that sings. We have developed a need that we cannot satisfy in reality, to hear people in the most difficult situations speak well, and at length, and we are delighted when the tragic hero still finds words, reasons, eloquent gestures, and altogether intellectual brightness, where life approaches abysses, and men in reality usually lose their heads, and certainly linguistic felicity. This kind of deviation from nature is perhaps the most agreeable repast for human pride. For its sake, man loves art as the expression of a lofty, heroic unnaturalness and convention. We rightly reproach a dramatic poet if he does not transmute everything into reason and words, but always retains in his hands a residue of silence, just as we are dissatisfied with the operatic composer who cannot find melodies for the highest sentiments, but only a sentimental, natural stammering and screaming. At this point, nature is supposed to be contradicted. Here, the vulgar attraction of illusion is supposed to give way to a higher attraction. End quote. A lot of what Nietzsche talks about here is, I would say, self-explanatory given what we've already covered so far, even just in this read-through. But let's zero in on a couple of things. When one is in a state of fury, we do not typically declare the truth of that fury in verses so powerful and explicit as those of Clytemnestra. Just in reality, the emotions don't express themselves as articulately and beautifully as they do in a Greek drama. When you're enraged in real life in an angry confrontation, what comes out is probably more likely to be a string of obscenities or just, I don't know what, wild raving, right? But Aeschylus takes that fury and he gives it a beautiful voice. He gives it beautiful verses. And that falsification, once again, somehow still gives us an insight into the internal logic of fury, assuming, indeed, that every passion has its own form of logic, its own form of internal reasoning. But in this second paragraph, Nietzsche brings in a new element, that this way of experiencing the passions, of experiencing human nature, through representation, and therefore through magnification, through simplification, so on and so forth, that creates a need that cannot be satisfied by reality. Because again, real rage is not as articulate as theatrical rage. Actual sadness isn't as aesthetically pleasing as a new wave album or, a moody college art film. Oftentimes, real sadness is just unpleasant and ugly. And in fact, Nietzsche says on the stage, the characters reach a kind of intellectual height, a height of eloquence, at the precise moment of approaching the abyss. Whereas in real life, that's when we lose our heads. An example, think of the Tears in the Rain monologue from the end of the original Blade Runner. Wonderfully written scene. Much of this was actually ad-libbed by the actor, Rutger Hauer, as well. But that's a character who is quite literally about to die. I mean, he dies pretty much immediately after giving this final monologue. So it's very theatrical, it's very Greek, it's very Shakespearean in that way even. And he provides this beautiful, poetic rumination on the incredible experiences he's had and the injustice of mortality that will destroy that history and those truths to which he has borne witness. But in real life, when people approach the abyss, when they know they're about to die, they typically don't offer such a poetic monologue. Usually, as Nietzsche says, they lose a certain felicity of language. And you know what this makes me think of? This is kind of a weird digression, but I can give an example of this as well. I once spent quite a great deal of time listening to recordings of black boxes taken from planes that crashed, or reading the transcripts as well. It was a whole rabbit hole that I went down for quite a while, actually. And that might just seem like something weird and morbid, and perhaps it is, but there was an artistic reason for this, as well as just an element of boredom. Basically, there was something that became a hobby horse between me and Jeff, the bassist and destroyer of light at the time. And I remember, one night we were on the back patio of this bar. It's probably like 9 or 10 years ago now. And we came onto the topic of plane crashes. I think a plane had just crashed somewhere, and Jeff starts talking about these black box recordings. And he kind of gets me, it was already kind of a thing he was into. He gets me down this weird rabbit hole of the internet of people who are obsessed with, plane crashes in general, but specifically these recordings of basically the last words of the pilots. And so it's interesting because when people go to aviation school, they end up studying many of these notable incidents in which something went wrong and the plane went down. And they do this because every single one of these incidents is a learning experience, really, because so much of the equipment and the changes to the equipment on modern airliners is there today because of a mistake that someone made in the past, or an accident that occurred that resulted in the plane crashing. So there's a very interesting scientific element to this, and looking at why the planes crashed and learning about the underlying causes, and then going and reading the transcript of the people trying to solve the problem in real time, seeing how they react to the problem, understanding why their reaction was almost always the wrong reaction, although sometimes there was genuinely nothing they could do. Although it seems like in most cases, even when a crash is caused by a mechanical failure, it's almost always exacerbated by human error in most of the cases where the plane crashes. But anyway, so when you're out on the road, when you're on tour, driving every day and bouncing back and forth between the van and the venue and the hotel room and, so on and so forth, you need little things like this to keep you occupied. So maybe it was morbid, but we really got into plane crashes for a little bit, like plane crash lore. And so we'd be, looking up and telling each other about different crashes, and the most interesting thing to me was recounting the final words of the pilots. And that's something that made it more interesting, is that, beyond the dispassionate scientific interest in the plane crashes and what makes plane crash, you're also reading a rather remarkable transcript or hearing a remarkable recording, in that it's somebody's very last words. And in the cases where they know they're going to crash and there's nothing they can do about it, and they have a solid number of seconds or even a minute to talk, it's kind of a wild moment in human life because of the black box, that ends up being preserved. And so that was a whole thing I got really into. What was my point in this? Okay, yeah. So you know what the last things are that people say in that situation? Jeff and I talked about this a lot, and we categorized the last words into 3 different categories of just general overall categories. And we also figured out the conditions that were likely to produce these different categories. So in cases where the end is coming very fast, you're flying in darkness, your radar isn't working, all of a sudden the clouds clear and you see you're about to fly straight into a mountain, and you have 5 seconds. Usually what people say is some variation on "oh shit" in whatever language, the equivalent expression, right? There's one black box transcript where the last words were literally just "mountains." But if there's a little more time, it can kind of split into 2 other categories depending on one main factor. Did one of the people in the cockpit cause everyone's unavoidable death? And if so, their last words are likely to be something like "I'm sorry," and everyone else is likely saying something like "fuck you, you killed all of us." And there are an uncomfortable number of these that basically end with one pilot telling the other, "fuck you, you killed everybody on this plane." And there's never any forgiveness expressed during these last moments. That just sounds awful to me, to know you killed everybody and be begging for forgiveness and have your co-pilot tell you basically, "fuck you." So yeah, that's really sad. But if that isn't the case, and there's no culpable party to rage against, and the end isn't really that sudden, you kind of have enough time to really understand, okay, we're going to die and I've got a couple minutes left. Usually what people say is either "I love you, God," or Jesus, or Allah, or whatever the deity is, or "I love you, so-and-so," usually their spouse, or "I love my wife, I love my kids." And I've personally never heard any black box in which the pilots soliloquize about the nature of mortality, or the cruelty of impermanence, or the fickle nature of fate, or anything of that kind. It's all very unpoetic. It's all very predictable and prosaic. But that's real life, And art has it has given us a desire for something that cannot be fulfilled in reality. That it's given us a preference for a reality that is heightened, a reality that's sort of glossed over and beautified we might say justified by aesthetics. That's Nietzsche's own project in Birth of Tragedy. It's only as an aesthetic phenomenon that life is eternally justified. But why would that be the case? Why would we have a taste for the unreality that is portrayed in art? We might think of the first aphorism we covered in this session, the pleasure in unreason. Madness as possessing an appeal insofar as there is an ecstasy in departing from the commonly shared perceptions of reality. So is this fulfilled by art in some way? Is it somewhat mad, the notion that a character on the verge of dying ought to make an eloquent speech? In art, nature is supposed to be contradicted. At these moments, nature is supposed to be contradicted. It is a vulgar attraction to illusion that we are satisfying, to unreality that we are satisfying. Why would that be? How would we gain such a desire for something that can only be satisfied by unreality? So that's the way in which that first aphorism concerning madness and the sovereignty of unreason ties back into this discussion of art. So let's continue with the passage. Quote, "The Greeks went far, very far in this respect, alarmingly far. Just as they made the stage as narrow as possible and denied themselves any effects by means of deep backgrounds, just as they made facial expressions and easy movements impossible for the actor, and transformed him into a solemn, stiff, masked bogey, they also deprived passion itself of any deep background, and dictated to it a law of beautiful speeches. Indeed, they did everything to counteract the elementary effect of images that might arouse fear and pity, for they did not want fear and pity. Giving all honor, and the highest honors, to Aristotle, he certainly did not hit the nail, much less on the head, when he discussed the ultimate end of Greek tragedy. Just look at the Greek tragic poets to see what it was that most excited their industry, their inventiveness, their competition. Certainly not the attempt to overwhelm the spectator with sentiments. The Athenian went to the theater in order to hear beautiful speeches, and beautiful speeches were what concerned Sophocles. Pardon this heresy." End quote. Okay, so beautiful speeches are what concerns Sophocles. What is Nietzsche getting at here? I would argue that it is that superordinate sense of cheerfulness that one derives from tragedy that he mentions in Birth of Tragedy. The kind of divine, magical aura that Oedipus shall leave behind at his place of burial. This is a metaphor for the operation of art, of theater. It takes events which ought to be horrifying or scandalizing or repulsive, and it covers them over with a magical aura of the eloquent speech. That's the Greek drama. So Oedipus has committed parricide and incest. He's stabbed out his own eyes. He lives an ignominious and tormented life as a beggar. All of this is merely a vehicle for actors to deliver impassioned, beautiful speeches. That's the real concern of Sophocles, the raison d'etre of his entire corpus. And as Nietzsche says, that perhaps contrary to the way we create artistic representations today, for example in cinema, the Greeks didn't aim for realism. They didn't aim for dramatic special effects. I mean, some attempts in this direction existed, but for the most part they narrowed down everything to the art of oration. By masking the actors, you take away their ability to use facial expression, so it isn't even really the full art of acting as we'd understand it in theater or film. It's purely delivery of lines, of verses. It's a vocal art. It's an art of the voice, of the tone of voice, and the pacing, and the inflection, and the rhythm, the vibrato of the voice even. The Greek theater is this art of giving voice to. This was the arena in which the Greek playwrights competed against one another, giving voice to the sentiments of the great sentiments of mankind is the art of oratory. But it's not necessarily that they're not trying to overwhelm the audience with sentiments. Again, as Nietzsche emphasizes, they didn't want fear and pity. So Nietzsche says Aristotle was wrong about this when Aristotle says in his Poetics that tragedy is about catharsis. Nietzsche has made this point before. He makes it in Birth of Tragedy. The point was not to purge these feelings by experiencing them. The point from Nietzsche's point of view is that artistic elevation of reality. The point is to give these feelings a beautiful voice. All right, so we'll finish the passage. Quote, "It is very different with serious opera. All of its masters take pains to prevent anyone from understanding their characters. Occasionally, picking up a word must help the inattentive listener, but on the whole the situation must explain itself, and the speeches do not matter. That is what all of them think, and hence they have their fun with the words. Perhaps they merely lacked the courage to express fully their ultimate lack of regard for words. With just a little more impertinence, Rossini would have had everybody sing nothing but la 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 la, and that would have made good rational sense. Confronted with the characters in an opera, we are not supposed to take their word for it, but the sound. That is the difference. That is the beautiful unnaturalness for whose sake one goes to the opera. Even the recitativo secco really is not meant to be heard as words and text. This kind of half-music is only supposed, first, to give the musical ear a little rest. Rest from the melody, as the most sublime, but therefore also the most strenuous enjoyment of this art. And then very soon also something else, namely a growing impatience, a growing irritation, a new desire for whole music, for melodies. How are things with Richard Wagner's art when we consider it in this perspective? Different, perhaps. Often it has seemed to me as if one had to memorize the words and the music of his creations before the performance. Otherwise, it seemed to me, one heard neither the words nor even the music." End quote. So, here, Nietzsche relates these insights to the modern day, and Wagner returns. And I think a lot of what Nietzsche discusses at the end, we already kind of talked about at length in Birth of Tragedy when we were discussing that. And not much has changed in his views, I would say. The main thing that seems to be interesting is that Nietzsche didn't like the centrality of the libretto, the overly wordy, overly narrative trend that was going on in opera. He liked the Wagnerian return to the centrality of the music. And yet Wagner is the one who's known for the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art, and hence Nietzsche's comments, one has to understand both the words and the music in order to grasp either one. The whole work is built from the ground up, so to speak, with all the parts interrelated and inseparable. In any case, in modern serious opera, Nietzsche says, we must grasp what is going on in the story purely by the emotional expression, or the way we're moved by the singing, not by trying to understand the words. Rossini would have had everyone just sing la la la. The words are not important. In opera, we're not supposed to take their word for it. We're supposed to take the sound of the voice to indicate what's going on. And that's... So both the Greek art of drama, of oratory, and modern opera are both purely vocal arts, and yet, in some sense, they're opposites. For the Greeks, the poetic construction of the verse, the meaning of the words, the sublime expression of the meaning is the point, and how the words are said is meant to convey that. With opera, the words are simply supposed to be vehicles for the music to convey these things. So, if we didn't know better, you might think that Wagner is presented as a sort of golden mean by Nietzsche in this passage. But, this is written around... This is in the 1880s. Nietzsche's already moved on from his friendship with Richard Wagner, and I think, to put it simply, Nietzsche still admired Wagner's musical genius and his genius as a composer. I think he's just pointing to something about Wagner that you could see as either a blessing or a curse, but ultimately, that is who Wagner is. He can't be anyone else as a composer. And I don't think it's quite as interesting to evaluate where Nietzsche stands as to which is the superior type of art, the vocalized art of opera or the verbose art of tragedy. It's not nearly as interesting as the qualitative descriptions he makes. Modern serious opera is driven by sound and tonality. Greek tragedy is driven by words and their expression. And the particularly interesting thing to think about that I'm not going to make further comment on, but that for all of us to think about is what each of those things reveals about the culture that created that form of expression. What kind of culture creates Greek tragedy in which everything is justified by making, characters speak beautifully even at the edge of the abyss, which is a complete unreality. What does it say about Italian opera that the characters could just sing la 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 and it would still convey the same thing? So let's go to a much shorter aphorism. This is section 81. Quote, "Greek taste. What is beautiful in it?" asked the surveyor, after a performance of Iphigenia. "Nothing is proved in it. Were the Greeks really so far from sharing this taste? In Sophocles, at any rate, everything is proved." End quote. So this passage should be straightforward, but it's unclear on one key point, which is Which Iphigenia play is Nietzsche referring to here? Is this refer to Iphigenia at Aulis, one of the last plays by Euripides? Is it Iphigenia among the Taurians, also by Euripides? Is it Iphigenia at Taurica, which was a modern retelling of that play? Perhaps the one written by Goethe. I mean, in the classical age, French, Italian, and German playwrights would write their own version of ancient dramas, use the same characters from Greek dramas. Jean Racine also wrote his version of Iphigenia at Aulis. And the only thing that gives me pause here is that it's likely that Nietzsche read all of these plays. And since the passage is about Greek taste, and Nietzsche asks whether the Greeks were really so far from sharing the taste of this figure in the passage he calls the surveyor, who seems to ridicule the play in question or to criticize it, that might imply to us that Nietzsche is referring to a modern production of Iphigenia and saying the Greek taste would have been opposed to our modern retelling of this Greek story. But that being said, I actually think the most likely thing is that Nietzsche is just referring to the play by Euripides, Iphigenia at Aulis. In that story, Iphigenia, daughter of Agamemnon, is sacrificed by him in order to appease Artemis and launch the fleet from Thrace in order to attack Troy. So again, Nietzsche invents this fictional character, the surveyor. He watches the play and says nothing is proved by it, and therefore I can't see anything beautiful in it. It's bad art, doesn't meet my taste. Another translation I have for this figure is geometrician, and I think Kaufman renders it as surveyor because a land surveyor is a person who has geometrical knowledge. They have to measure and account for land. It's a geometrical task, but also surveying has the connotation of looking or watching. It has a double meaning of perhaps being an audience member. I actually think geometrician might have been a better translation to use. Just drop that double meaning. The important thing for us to understand is that this is the kind of person who wants proofs, geometrical proofs, so to speak. QED, quod erat demonstrandum. So what kind of drama would interest such a person? Perhaps the Aesopian fable would meet the geometrician's taste, where a moral is proved by a kind of empirical demonstration in the tale. The tale of the tortoise and the hare proves, so to speak, that short and steady wins the race, right? May not be true in reality, but the story seems to prove it. What does the story of Iphigenia prove? Well, it's unclear. Agamemnon, far from enthusiastically sacrificing his daughter, out of it, maybe you could imagine some story that proves, like that might be the story of Abraham, right? That, Abraham is also, he's not enthusiastic to sacrifice his son, and they don't go through with the sacrifice. But the point is sort of like God says that you do it. Piety is more important than love of your family. But that isn't clear at all in the story of Iphigenia at Aulis. And, Agamemnon, furthermore, by going back and forth on whether he should actually sacrifice his daughter, he's an indecisive leader. He's motivated more by the fear of his own troops than by inner moral convictions as well. And Achilles, who is supposed to be like the bravest warrior of the Greeks in the Trojan War, well, he sides with Iphigenia. He's willing to lay down his life to defend her, even though all the Greek armies oppose him. And so, perhaps to us, he might seem heroic for doing this, but in the end, Iphigenia realizes her sacrifice would be the best way to avoid chaos and bloodshed if she goes along with it willingly. And Achilles acquiesces to this as well. Clytemnestra is outraged and horrified by this turn of events, and she swears to kill Agamemnon, right? Which the audience knows she eventually does. But so is Agamemnon a heroic character, or is he a villainous character? Sussing that out is sort of the entirety of the Agamemnon by Aeschylus, trying to figure out that question, or that the entirety of the Oresteia sort of leaves that question open-ended, we'll say. So what is the point? What was the moral? And I think Nietzsche's meaning in this passage is very subtle. It's only explicable if we consider that last line, in Sophocles, everything is proved, and especially if we consider that sentence cross-referenced with the statements in the very next section in 82, which we'll obviously look at next, which I think is a continuation of these insights. But it's often the case that Nietzsche emphasizes the Dionysian aspect of the Greek culture as their defining trait, right? But remember, the Dionysian can only be a defining trait of a culture if that culture can survive the Dionysian, which most cultures don't. So how did the Greeks survive it? How did they absorb it and incorporate it? The Dionysian is a great, magnificent excess of feeling, and the Greeks incorporate it because they're also excessively intellectual and orderly and clear-headed in their thought. And so while Nietzsche often emphasizes that Dionysian aspect of the Greeks in his other work, a lot of the gay science contains these passages in which Nietzsche not only emphasizes the excessively Apollonian nature of the Greeks, but also criticizes them for it. And in any case, in the dramas of Sophocles, just to take Oedipus as an example, one could say that the moral of the Oedipus drama is in a way perfectly explained. It's a self-contained system in a way. From a modern perspective, we might consider it somewhat meaningless in the moral sense to say that Oedipus is fated to become a murderer and a parricide, and therefore he has to become one. But the narrative of the play is essentially, it's like a tracing back of all the previous events and an accounting for everything that has happened, a sort of tracing back over all of the relevant facts in order to construct a logical narrative of how we got to this place. And it might seem puzzling and capricious and arbitrary, the role that the gods play or the fates play in engineering this fate of Oedipus, but it has a perfect, cold logic to it. Oedipus was fated to kill his father and marry his mother, and if we disentangle the knot of exactly how this played out, he suffers the fate deserved by one who is committed by such impieties, regardless of what their intentions were or what their level of knowledge might have been. Everything is sort of accounted for in the drama of Sophocles, we might say. Now, the only problem with this, and by the way, I don't necessarily agree with Nietzsche on this aphorism, and all of this seems to fly in the face of everything Nietzsche argued in Birth of Tragedy. That's the main problem here. Euripides in Birth of Tragedy is presented as the transitional form from Attic tragedy to new Attic comedy. And, therefore, Nietzsche alleges he was part of the transformation of the Greek culture from the Hellenic civilization that celebrated the Dionysian into this purely rational, theoretical culture that did not celebrate the Dionysian. But here Nietzsche seems to say no. There was a logic to the dramas of the solidly Hellenic playwrights, like Sophocles, and there's actually an illogic to Euripides, that the older Greekism, as he calls it, was actually distinguished from the younger Greekism by the fact that the older Greeks were actually more clear-headed and more logical. And so if you were to read this aphorism, and especially the next aphorism we're about to read, right after reading Birth of Tragedy, I think it could make your head spin. Because it's almost the opposite of what he argues there. But again, there is a subtle point that Nietzsche's making. And to get here, we have to make kind of an interpretive jump based on what we know about Nietzsche's understanding of the Greeks more broadly. And that is to say that when you excise the Dionysian, you don't get a pure Apollonian, and vice versa. The Dionysian represents dissolution, and the Apollonian represents individuation, but Dionysus without Apollo isn't Dionysus anymore. He's just pure dissolution. He becomes pure formlessness, which means he even loses the form of the god Dionysus, if that makes sense. So the image-making faculty of Apollo is necessary to conceive of and contain, and then therefore to propitiate Dionysus. Likewise, the purely individuating anti-dissolutionist society is not really Apollonian. It's, as Nietzsche says, it's theoretical and moralistic. It's Socratic, it's Alexandrian, it's Hellenistic, whatever we want to call it. But without that vital fire at the heart of it, it's like a kind of dead or detached logic. And so it isn't reason as reason is revealed in nature or in the instincts. It's reason in the purely intelligible realm, the reason of pure theory and zero practicality. Accordingly, a rational ideal for human behavior and a constant tension owing to the fact that human behavior never reaches that ideal. And so it's perpetual criticism then, perpetual condemnation, and then withering of action, atrophy of one's physical and vital capabilities. And there is something about that kind of approach to life, that modus vivendi, which is, in a paradoxical way, not reasonable. Because when is a hypothesis, when is a theory proved? Well, it's proved by practice. It's proved by testing. by experiment. Without that practical application, with the theory is nothing. If one doesn't live by the rule, but merely imagines the rule, then it's not really a rule. It's simply an ideal, and ideals always indicate a lack. Whatever we idealize indicates a lack in reality somewhere. And so perhaps we could make that interpretive leap, that stretch, and say Nietzsche's real critique is that a purely theoretical society isn't even logical, and this even comes out in the sort of, like, the Euripidean drama seems to be a more, what would we say? The most illuminating phrase that he uses, that everything in human life is confined to a narrow sphere of solvable problems. That certainly seems like a more theoretical approach to dramatizing human life, and yet Nietzsche would seem to indicate in this passage that in the end, nothing is proved by it. So with that, we will move on to 82, and I think some of these insights we've already talked about are going to help us on that passage as well. Quote, Esprit as un-Greek. The Greeks were exceedingly logical and plain in all of their thinking. They never wearied of that, at least during their long good period, as the French so often do, who just love to take a little leap into the opposite and really can endure the spirit of logic only if, owing to a lot of such little leaps into the opposite, it betrays its sociable readiness for pleasantry, its sociable self-denial. Logic they considered necessary, like bread and water, but also like these as the kind of nourishment that is fit for prisoners if it is to be taken straight, with nothing added. In good society, one must never wish to be solely and entirely right, which is what all pure logic aims at, hence the small dose of unreason in all French esprit. The sociability of the Greeks was far less developed than that of the French, has been, and still is. That is why you find so little esprit even in their most spirited men, so little wit even in their wittiest men, and alas, even these sentences will meet with disbelief, and how many more of that sort I am tempted to add. Est res magna tacere, said Martial, like all garrulous people. End quote. So the first paragraph can be a little confusing, because Nietzsche begins talking about the Greeks, but then goes on to talk about the French for most of the paragraph. But he says the Greeks were exceedingly plain and logical, and understanding this in light of the Dionysian interpretation of the Greeks that Nietzsche puts forward, I think that's all explained by everything that we've talked about so far. They were remarkable because they possessed an equal excess of both logic and order and self-remembering, as well as an excess of ecstasy and frenzy and self-forgetting. But Nietzsche says even during their long good period, the Hellenic period is what he means, the period of the so-called older Greekism, they never wearied of being logical and clear-headed, and that's why he brings up the French as by way of comparison. Their own conception of the spirit, which is also the intellect, the mind, esprit, it involves this element of mercuriality, of reason leaping into its opposite, that the French good taste sees logic as something akin to bread and water. I mean, sure, we all need food and water to live, but if you only eat bread and water, that's the diet of a prisoner. And so to explain what Nietzsche is talking about here, by concrete example, he says in good society, one never wishes to be finally and entirely right. This is like the attitude of Montaigne, the cool detachment of a certain type of French intellectual who is more than willing to say, this is what my reason tells me, but what do I know? What do any of us really know, right? Part of the social etiquette of high society usually involves restraining oneself from turning a polite dinner discussion into an out-and-out war in which one demands to be acknowledged as the sole victor of an argument or the sole possessor of truth. It's kind of bad manners to try and be the sole possessor of truth in good society. And so, in comparison, the Greeks, what does Nietzsche say about them? Well, they didn't have as developed a social conception of spirit or of intellect as we do, or as the French did, which one could construe as a flaw of the Greeks. I mean, that's why they never wearied of being clear-headed and logical, even though to us, such an approach to life or such a way of living is like, just taking plain bread and water. Why did they not weary of it? Because it was still new to them. Remember, there's that other passage earlier in the book where Nietzsche describes the struggle towards sobriety, towards a clear-headed, logical view of the world as something that the Greeks succeeded in doing as part of a very long and gradual process. He talks about how very hard it was just to be able to devote the inner calories to just thinking, to just having a thought. That we take all this for granted, but he compares it in another passage that I don't think we've quite reached yet to clearing land and marshes and forests and striking forward to pave roads and tame the wilds. That was what Nietzsche... That's the metaphor he uses for what it was like to tame and order the human mind over long generations. And so this new discovery of a reasonable way of being, that was something new and something incredible and something amazing. And so therefore, they were not as well developed in their conception of mind and spirit. So we find so little spirit even in their most spirited men. And why does Nietzsche say, well, this is a very heretical thing to say, this kind of critique of the Greeks? That's why he quotes Marshall, who... I didn't give the translation, but it means it's a big deal to remain silent. That basically implies I could add so many more sentences, so many more ways that the Greek mind is actually, in many ways, like a less developed version of our own, but I'd best remain silent because you probably already find what I'm saying to be beyond belief. Why would he say that? I mean, that's the Greek craze in Germany and in Europe in general during the classical and the Romantic periods were... making those kinds of criticisms of the Greeks would kind of be met with a snort and a chuckle for most intellectuals, probably. So let no one say that Nietzsche slavishly idolized the Greeks, because in these passages, he's often critical of Greek culture in a number of ways. All right, we're going to do one final section today. So that'll be number 83. I think that's a fine one to end on, because it sort of continues this exploration of the same topic, which is artistic expression and also the translation of expressions into different cultural contexts, so to speak. All right, 83, quote, "Translations. The degree of the historical sense of any age may be inferred from the manner in which this age makes translations and tries to absorb former ages and books. In the age of Corneille and even of the Revolution, the French took possession of Roman antiquity in a way for which we would no longer have courage enough, thanks to our more highly developed historical sense. And Roman antiquity itself, how forcibly and at the same time how naively it took hold of everything good and lofty of Greek antiquity, which was more ancient. How they translated things into the Roman present. How deliberately and recklessly they brushed the dust off the wings of the butterfly that is called moment. Thus, Horace now and then translated Alcaeus or Archilochus, and Propertius did the same with Callimachus and Philetus, poets of the same rank as Theocritus, if we may judge. What was it to them that the real creator had experienced this and that, and had written the signs of it into his poem? As poets, they had no sympathy for the antiquarian inquisitiveness that precedes the historical sense. As poets, they had no time for all those very personal things and names, and whatever might be considered the costume and mask of a city, a coast, or a century. Quickly, they replaced it with what was contemporary and Roman. They seemed to ask us, should we not make new for ourselves what is old, and find ourselves in it? Should we not have the right to breathe our own soul into this dead body? For it is dead, after all. How ugly is everything dead. They did not know the delights of the historical sense. What was past and alien was an embarrassment for them, and being Romans, they saw it as an incentive for a Roman conquest. Indeed, translation was a form of conquest. Not only did one omit what was historical, one also added allusions to the present, and above all, struck out the name of the poet and replaced it with one's own, not with any sense of theft, but with the very best conscience of the Imperium Romanum." End quote. So what is Nietzsche talking about? The development of a historical sense. What is the historical sense? We gain a historical sense as we come to a consciousness that the things that people believed in during a given time and place, things people valued, the moral code, metaphysical beliefs, aesthetics, whatever. Those owe to different circumstances according to the age, which then, if taken seriously, would also apply to yourself and the beliefs of your own time, and that would be in contradistinction to the views of truth which are universalist, or we might think of like Whig history, the interpretation of all history as if it's a progression, a development of human reason, that what we have today, the morals we have today are better or truer than the beliefs of people in past ages. For Nietzsche, that would be a viewpoint lacking in the historical sense, because the key thing to understand is that, again, the beliefs and values of a people are conditioned, or they're contingent. A culture's beliefs will have to do with, the geography and the climate and the way sustaining themselves and the kind of enemies that they fight. And what their enemies believe is often going to affect the things that they affirm. And so their recognition of what type of beliefs sustain them, right? What kind of beliefs they find necessary. That isn't a matter of the values being true or not. It's a matter of determining to what degree those beliefs are life-preserving or species-preserving, or we might say culture-preserving or culture-rearing. And here I'm mostly just citing an idea from Beyond Good and Evil. Remember, another book we could cross-reference here is In Human, All Too Human, where Nietzsche says he finds the historical sense badly developed and lacking in even many of the great philosophers. Most of them begin from the position that the truths of their time and place are universal, and then they interpret past cultures and foreign cultures from that perspective. Now, is having a historical sense good or bad? If you've been reading Nietzsche long enough, you should know better than to answer that question with a simple yes or no. It really depends on who and what you are. So, in the essay on the use and abuse of history for life, Nietzsche says, the Greeks would have found us moderns to be badly educated. But meanwhile, the average Athenian was completely lacking in any historical sense, whereas we basically consider a historical education to be synonymous with education, in the general sense of the term education, right? We conceive of education as learning facts, gathering and understanding, understanding the series of things that happened, whether as historical events or empirical data that's been gathered in scientific tests or whatever. Whereas for the Greeks, education would be better conceived as, to put it crudely, a process of internalization. That is to say, learning something with your body, the way the muscles learn when you acquire muscle memory when playing a sport, or playing an instrument, or defending yourself with a weapon, or martial arts, or whatever it might be. So in that essay, Nietzsche says the modern person is like a walking encyclopedia, and the Greeks would not have understood us. He would, he would see that the Greek would regard the modern person as somebody who has external culture but is internally a barbarian. And Nietzsche would seem to imply that the unhistorical people, the Greeks, were far superior to us, at least from his own subjective aesthetic taste. And yet, in Human, All Too Human, that's precisely why he criticizes the other philosophers. The congenital defect of philosophers is part and parcel with a lack of historical sense. So to put it one way, it's not necessarily a quote-unquote good thing for your society to develop a historical sense. It might be better not to have it, because after all, knowledge kills action, and historical knowledge can impair our capacity to act. But on the other hand, is it better for a philosopher to develop a historical sense? That's a much better question. Well, without one, he's not really a philosopher, is he? Without a historical sense, the philosopher is really just a species of priest. And that's what Nietzsche says most philosophers have been. Just a subspecies of the holy man, a person who promotes the pre-existing metaphysics and morals, albeit probably in a new form and some new logical formulation, but it's fundamentally the same activity and the same operation in society that the priest engages in. This would then lead to the question, is it good or bad if your society develops philosophers? And again, there's no definitive answer to that. It depends. If you want more on this, you can look into the episodes I did on philosophy in the tragic age of the Greeks. So given all of this, let's go back to the passage, though. How can you tell if an entire culture has, on the balance, a well-developed historical sense or a poorly developed historical sense? It's by the way they translate the works of other cultures. Do they do it like the French did with the works of Roman antiquity, which was the same way the Romans incorporated the Greeks into the Imperium Romanum? That is to say, do they do it by taking the works and adapting them to be understandable, to be useful in the current modern context, ignoring the original context? Nietzsche says, as poets, the Romans had no, antiquarian inquisitiveness. They were eager to take whatever cultural symbolism or imagery or references, which may have been meaningful in the Greek context, and replace it with whatever made more sense in the Roman context. And think of, when we go over old works of fiction on this show, for example, Greek drama, how often we have to stop and disentangle or unpack some reference that would have been grasped immediately by an ancient Greek, but is unknown to us, right? If you just mention, the Pythia. How many people know what that is? Most people don't. So you have to kind of stop and explain it. So when you translate the work, do you leave in all those things that are like culturally inexplicable, the references and imagery and allusions that mean nothing to the average person? We don't even have to go back to ancient Rome to encounter this problem. If you read Shakespeare, there are references to things that modern people have no reference for, no understanding of. So the approach of the translator with the historical sense is to leave all of that in. And Kaufmann argues in the footnote on this passage, this was largely how the Germans and their scholars attempted to approach the ancient world in the late 1700s and throughout the 1800s, by doing as faithful a translation as possible in full understanding that the perspective of the Greek world was a very different cultural outlook from our own, that there would be things in the translation that are lost, that are just inexplicable. The opposite approach would be to do, say, like a Shakespeare adaptation or a Greek adaptation in the modern day, perhaps in modern language, as people have done, where all the references to the Greek settings and the cultural and religious allusions, which don't make sense to us anymore, or don't carry the same feeling for us, that's all replaced with modern analogs, which attempt to perhaps translate the same feeling, but removed from their cultural context. Here's something recently. Coppola's new film, that story about Catiline, that's taken from Rome and placed essentially into New York City. I know it's New Rome in the film, but Coppola has said as much. It's basically a story from ancient Rome placed into the social and cultural context of modern-day New York, or just a modern-day megacity. And so in that film, like one of the things, Catiline is accused of seducing a Vestal virgin. But what is, the average person, you bring up what a Vestal virgin, ask them what a Vestal virgin is, they won't know, right? They don't exist anymore. The modern person can't understand what kind of crime that would be, or what kind of immorality or impiety that would be. We can't understand how immoral that is to a Roman. Scandalous is not the word. Evil is not the word. It's certainly severe enough, but it's the wrong sense. It's impious, we might say, but the word impious to the modern ear, it's so declawed and abstract for most people. We don't really celebrate the virtue of piety in public life. Most of us are impious people. It's pretty hard for us to understand the reaction of like one of the most, pious societies of all time. How would they react to the most impious possible thing you could ever do? Seducing a Vestal virgin is like, you're like betraying the gods and betraying the city. You're endangering everyone you know and love. You're also doing something disgusting at the same time. So the closest they get in that film, in what's Coppola's film called? Megalopolis, the accusation that Catiline seduced like a virginal pop star, basically like Hannah Montana or the Olsen twins back in the day or something. I don't know exactly. Maybe that gets halfway there, but there's no actual perfect analogy, because there's no sense of the sacred with a pop singer, really. It's probably just the closest allegory that Coppola could find for what this accusation would mean and how serious it would be. And that's the best he can do, because he's translating a story in a way that is intentionally lacking in the historical sense. In other words, a lack of the historical sense is what leads you to extract a universal truth from a story and present it in a completely different context. The lack of the historical sense leads you to think there's an eternal moral reality, something that can be translated into my modern context that I can take from this story. And it's a very interesting thing to contemplate. Do we, for the most part, produce these translations that lack the historical sense, or do we translate with an awareness of the historical sense? Kaufmann seems to think that the English-speaking world in general inclines toward a lack of the historical sense, the same approach as the Romans in incorporating the Greeks. And that seems to have a sense to it because, the English-speaking world is sort of inherited from Britain. There's a way in which an empire that tries to embrace the whole world under its dominion, as Britain once did, naturally inclines towards syncretism. That's a reliable way of managing empires. And so you kind of naturally develop a sense for seeing the universal truth. You look for that, the truth that can be decontextualized and made equivalent to another truth in a different cultural language. So, on the most basic level in ancient Rome, your sun god is pretty similar to my sun god. Maybe they're different faces of the same sun god. Your tragedy tells the story of vengeance yielding to justice. Maybe I can tell the same story, but in the context of my modern culture, because the important thing is the eternal truth at the heart of that story. So perhaps England had this mentality as one of those world-embracing empires, and therefore the English-speaking world has a sort of aptitude for decontextualizing truths, that decontextualizing stories and poems and cultural capital and putting it into a new language. That's what empires do, really. They take custody of and they incorporate cultural capital. Whereas the 19th century Germans, for one, they're not an empire. Very different type of society. Very unique among European cultures. And they were still trying to render Greek verses in like dactylic hexameters, the way the Greeks did it. If you ever try to write in hexameter, in English at least, it's a very unnatural thing to do. Everyone generally learns about iambic pentameter because of Shakespeare and Spenser and those great English poets that we learn about in school. And, so standard iambic pentameter at the beginning of Spenser's Faerie Queene, a gentle knight was pricking on the plain. That's a sentence in iambic pentameter. Da-da, 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 da-da. To put it in hexameter would mean adding an additional iamb, which makes the phrase just feel a bit overextended. And it's not impossible to write that way in English. Spenser includes hexameters at the end of every stanza, but he does, 8 pentameters and then 1 hexameter, right? Because it's hard. It's really hard. I can't imagine writing a whole poem in hexameter, trying to translate a whole work of hexameters into English. You can throw them in, but it's just really difficult. And so it's a testament to the German attempt to authentically represent the structure and the tempo of Greek speech, even when translated into their own mother tongue. That's a testament to their historical sense. Because, and again, to go back to another example, in the English-speaking world, usually we just put everything into plain speech. I was complaining, on Twitter, I guess probably a couple months ago now, there was a new show on Netflix that I absolutely hated called Chaos. That was about the Greek gods and heroes, but, put into a world that resembles our modern world. And this was a giant exercise in translating with zero historical sense. And the end product is something that is thoroughly un-Greek and that the Greeks would have been probably fairly revolted by. But that's largely how we in the modern age engage with past cultures and with those that don't share our beliefs. We approach them with that Whig history mentality, with this universalistic understanding of the world, and when we naturally, therefore, want to turn them into a mirror of ourselves. We, in the English-speaking world, always want to see ourselves in other people. We always are trying to see the ways in which apparently foreign or alien cultures are actually just like us, right? Again, there are pros and cons to both approaches, but the interesting thing, I think, for us, and by the us here, I no longer mean the English-speaking world, I mean podcast listeners, free spirits, aspiring free spirits, whatever area you want to identify yourself. The interesting thing for us is the interpretive framework. Again, the method that Nietzsche provides. It's very hard to make any kind of generalized statement about an entire culture, because how do you do that? Aren't you always kind of speaking in the kind of statistical abstract or something? Well, this is how you can make at least one kind of judgment about a culture, even if only provisionally. You can tell how well developed their historical sense is by their translations. Do they translate the cultural capital of other societies and cultures into something alien? Do they translate it into their language but recognize it as something foreign to their own perspective? Or do they translate into versions of themselves? Do they take the cultural capital, the characters, the great works of other cultures, and turn it into versions of what their culture is? And that's very interesting to consider in light of our modern culture in America today. I obviously have my own opinions on that, on which way we lean, which I probably fairly obvious given everything we've talked about, but it's worth thinking about for yourself. All right, well, that's all for this week, everybody. That's all the notes I have. Very much enjoying this return to the gay science. Obviously, we we returned for one episode, and then I had the week of Halloween recordings, so we're done with that now, and we're back on to getting through the nitty-gritty of this book. As soon as we come back for the next leg of Season 5, though, I'm very excited about some of the work we're covering, because we're getting into like really rigorous philosophy that's outside of Nietzsche, and it's a work that I've had requested many, many times. So I guess I'll start teasing it now without name dropping who exactly we're going to be talking about once we return from Book 2. But I anticipate we'll probably be done with Book 2 of The Gay Science with just like 2 more episodes, and then we'll be back to regular season episodes of the Nietzsche podcast. But all right, everybody, thank you for listening. Cheers, signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it, or on social media. Thank you for your support.